I still remember the exact morning everything changed. Not because somebody yelled, not because there were flashing lights or a sheriff's truck bouncing down my driveway, but because for the first time in nearly 40 years, my cattle were standing shoulder to shoulder along the creek without making a sound. They weren't drinking, they weren't grazing, they were just staring at a ribbon of mud where clear spring water had always been flowing. And if you've spent your whole life raising cattle, you know animals notice trouble long before people do. My name's Owen Harper. I'm 68 years old, and my family has been running the same ranch outside Silver Mesa, Colorado, for 3 generations. My grandfather settled this place after the war. My father expanded it with his own hands, and I never wanted anything more complicated than enough rain, healthy calves, and a quiet life where neighbors respected fences and left each other alone. Because out here, that's how decent folks survive. The little creek crossing my pasture wasn't much to look at if you drove past it at highway speed. Just a narrow spring-fed stream winding through cottonwoods before cutting across my grazing fields. But that water kept nearly 200 head of cattle alive every summer, fed the hay fields, watered the horses, and carried more history than most people ever realize. My father used to kneel beside it every April, scoop up a handful of water, smile, and tell me, "Son, land feeds a man, water keeps him alive." And back then I thought he was just being poetic. Turns out he was teaching me the most expensive lesson I'd ever learn. Things started changing about 18 months before the creek went dry, when a luxury development company bought nearly 800 acres on the ridge overlooking my ranch. They arrived with glossy brochures, expensive pickups, survey crews wearing spotless boots, and enough confidence to convince everyone they were improving the county. They promised jobs, higher property values, beautiful custom homes with mountain views, private roads, landscaped entrances, artificial ponds, and all the fancy comforts wealthy folks seem to expect these days. Meanwhile, I just kept fixing fences and feeding cattle because none of that had anything to do with me. Or so I believed. The first time I met their project manager, a fellow named Trevor Mills, he walked onto my porch wearing sunglasses that probably cost more than my saddle, stretched out a hand with that polished corporate smile, and said, "Mr. Harper, we're excited to become neighbors." I shook his hand because that's what grown men do. Then I answered. Neighbors usually ask before crossing another man's fence. His smile tightened just enough for me to notice, because his survey crew had already wandered onto my pasture twice without permission. He laughed it off, called it an honest mistake, promised it'd never happen again, and drove away in a shiny black SUV that somehow never seemed to collect any dust. For a while, nothing happened except more construction noise echoing off the hills, excavators, concrete trucks, and crews working from sunrise until dark. Then little things started bothering me. Patches of grass near the creek turned brown weeks earlier than usual. The water level dropped a little every afternoon before recovering overnight. My cows spent longer searching for drinking spots. Even the deer stopped coming through as often. I blamed the weather because that's what ranchers do. We always blame the weather before we blame people. But something in my gut kept whispering that nature wasn't acting alone this time. One afternoon, I rode upstream on my old gelding, Rusty, following the creek farther than I usually bothered to go, and that's when I noticed fresh tire tracks leading through public land toward the construction site. Heavy equipment had been working somewhere they shouldn't have. The brush had been cleared, the soil was disturbed, and tucked behind a row of newly planted pine trees sat a metal pump the size of a refrigerator humming so quietly it almost blended into the wind. Thick underground piping disappeared beneath the earth, heading straight toward the hill where those luxury homes were taking shape. I climbed off my horse, walked closer, and watched crystal clear spring water rushing through that pipe instead of flowing naturally into my pasture. Somebody hadn't just borrowed a little water. They'd diverted the creek itself. I drove straight to the construction office the next morning, carrying nothing but a calm voice and 50 years of ranch manners. Trevor looked up from his desk like I'd interrupted something important. I asked him one simple question. "Did you reroute my water?" He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and actually smiled. "It's not your water, Mr. Harper. It's groundwater feeding a regional system." I told him the spring had supplied our ranch for generations, and every drop downstream was getting weaker. He shrugged like I was complaining about the weather. "We're fully permitted," he said. "Besides, it's just a little creek." I remember staring at him for a few seconds before answering. "Funny thing about little creeks, they're usually keeping something much bigger alive." He chuckled, looked back at his computer, and dismissed me with, "If you've got concerns, call the county." That was the moment I realized I wasn't dealing with neighbors anymore. I was dealing with people who believe money could rewrite geography. Over the next 2 weeks, the damage became impossible to ignore. Calves crowded around muddy puddles. One of my older cows collapsed from dehydration during an unusually hot afternoon. My veterinarian asked whether my water supply had changed because the entire herd was showing signs of stress. Meanwhile, every evening I could see fountains spraying into the air on top of that ridge. Fresh sod rolled across enormous lawns. Decorative waterfalls trickled beside million-dollar houses still waiting for their first owners. And every gallon sparkling in those fountains felt like another gallon stolen from the creek my father trusted with his life's work. I stood beside the cracked creek bed just before sunset one evening, listening to insects where running water should have been. Then I looked uphill toward those oversized homes glowing gold in the fading light. Their sprinklers hissed across perfect green grass, while dust swirled around my thirsty cattle below, and something inside me settled into a kind of quiet that surprised even me, because anger burns hot and disappears fast. Resolve is different. Resolve gets patient. I took my hat back, took one long look at the pipe hidden beneath that hillside, and said to nobody but myself, I'm done asking nicely. Now we're going to find out who actually owns that water. Now, let me pause the story for just a minute, because this is where a lot of people assume the loudest guy with the biggest bank account automatically wins, and that's exactly where they get into trouble. According to standard procedure, water rights in much of the American West aren't simply about who owns the land sitting above a spring or a creek. They're often tied to long-established legal rights that can be decades, sometimes even a century, older than the newest property deed. From a legal perspective, diverting water without the proper authorization can expose someone to injunctions, civil damages, restoration costs, and in some situations even regulatory penalties, especially if livestock, agriculture, or downstream users suffer measurable losses. This is a psychological trap. People with money sometimes convince themselves that confidence sounds the same as authority, so they stop asking permission and start assuming nobody will challenge them. But ranchers learn something different. We don't rush into fights because evidence ages better than anger. The lesson here is, if someone is violating your legal rights, the smartest move usually isn't revenge. It's documentation, patience, and letting the law become the loudest voice in the room. The next morning, I didn't drive to the developer's office. I didn't call Trevor, and I sure didn't grab a shovel and dig up that pipe. As satisfying as that might have felt for about 5 minutes, instead, I started doing what ranchers have always done when something doesn't look right. I paid attention. Every sunrise, I rode upstream with a notebook tucked inside my saddlebag, marking the creek level, taking photographs from the same spots, writing down the condition of my pasture and my herd, because facts don't get emotional, and facts don't forget. By Veneramier documented dehydration in several cattle. My hay production dropped noticeably within 2 weeks, and even neighbors who had lived there for decades admitted they had never seen that spring run so weak in the middle of summer. Before long, I hired a licensed surveyor named Caleb Norton, a quiet man who talked less than I did, which is saying something. He spent 3 days studying property markers that most people would have mistaken for old pieces of rusted steel sticking out of the ground. Then, he looked up at me and said, "Owen, you're going to want copies of everything I found. Those are words that'll make your stomach tighten, whether you're buying land or defending it." The survey revealed something I had suspected but couldn't prove on my own. The main diversion pipe crossed a protected utility easement without authorization before cutting through a narrow strip of county-controlled land. More importantly, the intake itself sat at a point that wasn't included in any approved construction documents Caleb could locate. That didn't automatically mean somebody had broken the law, but it raised enough questions that my attorney suggested bringing in a water resources engineer. 2 days later, the engineer measured the flow upstream and downstream, inspected the pumping equipment from publicly accessible land, and compared current water volumes with historical records. His report was simple, professional, and devastating. The spring was producing almost exactly what it always had. The missing water wasn't disappearing into thin air. It was disappearing into that pipeline. When my attorney, Margaret Ellis, spread all the reports across her conference table, she smiled in a way lawyers rarely smile unless they know the evidence is doing most of their work. She tapped the engineering report with one finger and said, "They're relying on confidence because they don't have documentation." Then she looked straight at me. "We're not going after revenge, Owen, we're going after compliance." I like the sound of that. Revenge makes headlines. Compliance wins cases. Within days, we filed for emergency relief, asking the court to require an immediate review of the diversion while ownership and water rights were examined. The judge didn't declare anyone guilty, and that's important, because courts generally don't work that way. What the judge did recognize was that there was enough documented evidence of potential ongoing harm to justify temporary action until the legal questions could be resolved. An inspection was scheduled. County officials were notified. Suddenly, the same people who had ignored my phone calls were returning every message within the hour. Trevor finally showed up at my ranch wearing another pressed shirt that looked like it had never seen a day's work. He climbed out of his SUV smiling the same polished smile I'd seen months earlier. "Mr. Harper," he began, "I'm sure we can work something out." I leaned against the fence and folded my arms. "Funny," I said. "That's the first time you've wanted to work something out." His smile faded. "You're creating delays that are costing people money." I nodded. "No, Trevor. Your decisions are costing people money." He tried another angle, offering to truck water to my ranch until things settled down. I almost laughed. My father didn't spend his life protecting that spring so somebody else could rent my own water back to me. Inspection day arrived under a cloudless sky. County engineers, environmental officials, survey crews, and a deputy sheriff met near the intake where the pipe disappeared underground. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody threatened anyone. The only sounds were boots on gravel, flipboards opening, cameras clicking, and water moving through steel. Trevor kept insisting everything had been approved, but each request for supporting documentation was met with another search through binders and another uncomfortable silence. One inspector looked over the engineering report, compared it with the installation on the ground, then quietly shook his head. That was the first moment I saw real concern spread across the developers team. By late afternoon, temporary orders were carried out. The unauthorized diversion point was isolated and sealed pending the court's final determination, and the pumping equipment connected to it was shut down. Nobody smashed anything. Nobody cut pipes apart with torches. Everything happened methodically, with paperwork, photographs, signatures, and witnesses. It wasn't dramatic in the Hollywood sense, but to a rancher who'd spent weeks watching his creek disappear, it was one of the most satisfying sights I'd ever seen. The change came faster than I expected. Within hours, the trickle through my pasture strengthened, and by the following morning, the creek sounded like itself again. That familiar, steady conversation between rocks and moving water I'd listened to for decades without ever thinking it might disappear. The cattle didn't need anyone to tell them. They wandered back to the banks almost instinctively, lowering their heads into clear running water, as though nothing had happened. Watching that was worth more to me than any courtroom victory. Things looked very different up on the ridge. Without that diverted supply, decorative fountains stopped spraying, irrigation systems shut down, and newly planted landscaping began showing signs of stress. Contractors scrambled to bring in temporary water while engineers searched for alternative sources that complied with local requirements. It turned out building luxury homes was easy. Securing a lawful long-term water supply was the difficult part. A few weeks later, the mediation process began. The developers' attorneys entered the room far less confident than before. The reports, surveys, photographs, veterinary records, and engineering analysis painted a timeline that was difficult to dismiss. Nobody wanted a prolonged legal fight anymore. They wanted a solution. After several hours, an agreement was reached. The diversion infrastructure connected to the disputed intake would be removed. Damaged portions of my property would be restored where necessary. Compensation would be provided for documented agricultural losses, and future water access for the development would have to come through legally approved sources instead of shortcuts hidden beneath the hillside. As we walked out of the courthouse, Trevor caught up with me near the parking lot. He looked older than he had just a few months earlier. "You really went through all this over a creek," he muttered. I looked back toward the mountains before answering. "No," I said quietly. "I went through all this because once people discover they can take one thing without consequence, they usually come back for the next." He didn't have an answer for that. Neither of us spoke again. I climbed into my dusty old pickup, drove home, and when I crossed the bridge over that little spring-fed creek, I rolled down the window just to hear the water flowing again. Because some victories aren't measured by what the other side loses. They're measured by hearing something precious return exactly where it belongs. Life has a funny way of settling back into its rhythm after a storm, almost like the land is reminding you that people come and go. Arguments fade. Court files collect dust. But the things worth protecting keep right on doing what they've always done. A couple of weeks after everything was resolved, I found myself sitting on the same weathered fence where my father used to drink his morning coffee, listening to the creek run through the pasture as if it had never been interrupted. The cattle spread out across the field without a care in the world. Calves splashed through the shallows. Red-winged blackbirds settled into the reeds again, and for the first time in months, the ranch sounded like home instead of a place waiting for bad news. Folks around town asked me if winning felt satisfying, and the truth usually surprised them. Relief. That's the word I'd use. Relief is quieter than victory. It doesn't celebrate somebody else's problems. It simply lets you breathe again. Looking back now, I don't think Trevor or the people behind that development ever woke up one morning planning to become villains. Somewhere along the line, they convinced themselves that efficiency mattered more than respect, that deadlines mattered more than neighbors, and that if enough money had already been invested, the rules would eventually bend to meet their schedule. I've seen that kind of thinking before, and it almost never ends well. According to standard procedure, good projects begin with permits, conversations, surveys, and cooperation, not assumptions. Skip those steps, and even the most beautiful development can end up buried under lawsuits, delays, and costs nobody planned for. From a legal perspective, this wasn't really about a rancher fighting wealthy developers. It was about documented rights, responsible resource management, and following the same legal process that exists to protect everyone, whether they own 20 acres or 2,000. Courts don't usually reward whoever shouts the loudest. They pay attention to evidence, consistency, and whether someone respected the law before asking it for help. That's something I wish more people understood. This is a psychological trap. When someone starts believing success makes them untouchable, every disagreement begins to feel like an inconvenience instead of a warning. Confidence slowly turns into entitlement. Entitlement turns into shortcuts, and shortcuts have a way of leading straight into consequences. Out here on a ranch, nature is brutally honest. You can't negotiate with a dry pasture. You can't convince thirsty cattle that everything is fine. Reality doesn't care how expensive your truck is or how impressive your business card looks. Water either reaches the creek or it doesn't. Grass either grows or it doesn't. That's one reason I've always trusted the land more than I trust people. The land never lies. Every now and then someone asks whether I'd do anything differently if I could live through those months again. Maybe I'd start documenting things sooner. Maybe I'd trust my instincts a little earlier. But I still wouldn't have sabotaged that pipeline or tried to settle the score myself. That would have given people something far more interesting to talk about than the truth. Patience isn't weakness. Sometimes patience is the strongest move a person can make because it gives the facts enough time to catch up with the fiction. My father once told me that every ranch eventually teaches its owner one lesson he'll never forget. I always assumed mine would be about drought or blizzards or losing cattle during a hard winter. Turns out, my lesson was about stewardship. Owning land doesn't simply mean enjoying it. It means protecting it for the people who come after you. Someday this ranch will belong to my grandchildren, and I hope when they stand beside this same creek years from now, they won't remember court hearings or engineering reports. I hope they'll remember that when something valuable was threatened, their grandfather chose integrity over anger and persistence over revenge. The lesson here is, the law isn't perfect. People certainly aren't perfect. But when ordinary people know their rights, keep good records, and refuse to let frustration make their decisions for them, justice has a much better chance of finding its way home. So now I'd like to hear from you. If you discovered someone was quietly taking something your family had relied on for generations, would you have stayed as patient as I did, or would you have confronted them the moment you found out? Share your thoughts down in the comments because these conversations matter, and every story brings a different perspective. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and come back for more stories about property rights, rural life, and the moments when ordinary people discover that standing your ground doesn't always require raising your voice. Sometimes it just requires refusing to back away.